Alright, here we go with Section 4. Section 4 is about Nixon in Vietnam and how he dealt with it, so Vietnam will end when Nixon is president. Alright, so objectives, we're going to describe the steps Nixon took to bring American forces home, how he did that, and then we're going to identify two factors that finally helped bring an end to the war in Vietnam. Alright, so Nixon, remember from Section 3, he will win the 1968 election and take over as a Republican president. Alright, so his national security advisor was Henry Kissinger. He was very important in getting us out of Vietnam. His linkage policy was aimed at improving relations with the Soviet Union and China, as these countries were top suppliers of aid to North Vietnam. Kissinger hoped to get the two communist nations to reduce their aid and to help end the war. Nixon did a few things to help with this. One, reforming the draft system. Two, he wanted to give Vietnam a bigger role in fighting the war, and he also expanded the bombing campaigns of enemy territory. Now, with each of these, the draft system, that was good. People were really, it was better. They were pleased with it. There were no longer college deferments, and the draft was based on a lottery. Protests against the draft started to fade because you only had to go if your number was picked, and it was based on your birthday and your last name alphabetically and things like that. There was different ways. It was kind of different how they did it. But anyway, that was better. He also reduced the number of troops in Vietnam with the intent that South Vietnamese soldiers take a more active role. That was our intent the whole time, was to teach the South Vietnamese how to do this, or how to fight by themselves. So with the draft system today, almost all men between the ages of 18 and 25 living in the U.S. must register for the draft. If a draft becomes necessary, men would be called in an order determined by a random lottery and date of birth. Men who are drafted must still meet requirements before they are inducted into the armed forces. Disabled men must register, but they would probably be disqualified from serving. Conscientious objectors also must register. So even if you say for religious reasons, you still have to do it, but you might get let out of it later. Now, with his bombing, people were not happy about this, per se. He was bombing enemy supply routes and hideouts in Cambodia and Laos. Now, Cambodia and Laos were neutral, but he decided to bomb them because the communists were using those countries to get their supplies from the north to the south. So, this is an area of conflict. Now, what risks did Nixon take by bombing other countries in addition to Vietnam? Starting another war, basically, with those countries. And we cannot spread ourselves that thin. So this is not a policy that a lot of people agree with bombing those other countries, Cambodia and Laos. There was peace talks in Paris. The Vietnamese took a wait-and-see attitude. Basically what this was is they believed that anti-war protesting would force the U.S. to withdraw, and then the North would just be able to go in and fight and take over the South. This is partially what happens, but there's other factors that are going to contribute to this too. Now, many Americans were outraged when Nixon expanded the war by sending troops into Cambodia in 1970 to destroy communist bases. Now, people weren't happy when they were bombing. They were even more upset when he sent people to Cambodia, because now we're fighting in another country that we know nothing about, and we're fighting. Okay, the country is just in they don't know what's going on in Vietnam. It's getting worse, but the end is near. By the 70s, after the bombing of Cambodia, anti-war protests erupted on college campuses across the country. Um, the two famous college protests will be at Kent State University, which is in Ohio. The other one is Jackson State, which is in Mississippi. They were both in May, and they both had similar things that happened. Now, the release of the secret Defense Department papers, known as the Pentagon Papers, we got a slide on that, to the New York Times caused support for the war to weaken even further, because this really showed people, this was published government documents, that the government was lying about what was actually happening. And the American people saw this and they were really irritated with that. Now, what did Kent State and Jackson State mean to the nation? They were shocked. The U.S. was shocked. They were symbolic of America's outrage over Vietnam. And it also showed that if you went and protest, violent things might happen. These two protests did turn violent. But we'll talk about those in a little bit. Now, the Pentagon Papers. This is all good stuff here. 1969, Nixon takes office. Okay, and some of the people that are involved with him are going to leak these papers. He calls for something called Vietnamization, which is for the Vietnamese to take a more active role in actually fighting. Nixon ordered the bombing of enemy supply routes in Cambodia and Laos. He kept the bombing a secret. Okay, this is why these papers are released, because he's secretly bombing Cambodia and not telling the American people what is going on. Okay, that's going to irritate a lot of people. There was more protesting that continued to expand, and after this, it's going to get worse. Nixon ordered attacks on communist bases in Cambodia. Many Americans felt Nixon had overstepped his boundaries by invading a neutral country, because technically this is not a war, it is a conflict, and since we have not declared war, he really does not have the right to send more troops and expand the area that we're fighting without a good reason or without telling Congress first. He needs to tell them what he is doing, but he's keeping it a secret. The protesting at Kent State and Jackson State. Now, I believe this is different here. Kent State was a military, the National Guard response. 4 students died and at least 9 more were wounded. They were having a rally at Kent State. There were 3,000 National Guard troops that were sent there. At Jackson State University, 2 students were shot and killed. A wave of student strikes followed the tragedies of Kent State and Jackson State. Hundreds of colleges and universities called off classes to avoid additional conflicts. And I believe the Jackson State one was not National Guard, it was actually the police. But I'm not sure, the book doesn't say here. But for sure, Kent State was military. And there's a famous song about the Kent State shootings. It's called Ohio, I believe, and it's by Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young. 1970, former Defense Department employee Daniel Ellsberg gives secret papers known as the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times. It was published. The Pentagon Papers revealed that the government had not been honest about the war in Vietnam. There's documentaries. There's a movie that just came out a couple years ago about this. It's got some pretty good depictions of what actually went on during this time period. Alright, so there's Kent State. That's a pretty famous picture. You could see that. There's the New York Times. The judge let them off after releasing the Pentagon Papers because they technically weren't breaking any laws because they weren't really classified documents. They could have been shown to anyone. They should have been told. The people should have been told about what was going on. So the charges were dropped, and that is a picture of Nixon. I believe that's his official presidential portrait. Alright, determine 3 cause and effect relationships described in the previous slide about the Pentagon Papers. Alright, so the first cause, Nixon approves the Cambodia invasion. The effect is lawmakers were angry because this was a secret action. They were not informed that Nixon was going to invade Cambodia. The next cause is Congress repeals the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. That is for under President Johnson. They allowed him to send in more troops. This is repealed. As a result, Nixon loses power to direct the war in Vietnam. So now it's really up to the people over there and the South Vietnamese to figure it out. And finally, Ellsberg leaked the Pentagon Papers documents to the New York Times. The effect, the support for the war weakened further, more protesting, etc. All right, now, the end of the war here. Nixon was reelected in 1972. He authorized the heaviest bombing of North Vietnam since the war had began. Probably not the best move, but he sees that the end is near, so he's trying one last-ditch effort to try to get the South to have the momentum. North Vietnam returned to peace talks. All sides reached an agreement in January of 1973. By 1975, the South was taken over. The North had launched a major offensive, and the South Vietnamese surrendered in 1975. So this conflict, at the time, was the longest conflict in U.S. history. It took a staggering toll. More than 1 million Vietnamese died. 58,000 Americans were dead, and 300,000 more were wounded. Many were permanently disabled. The United States had spent $150 billion on the war. 2.7 million Americans served in Vietnam. But unlike World War II vets, when they returned home, they did not get a hero's welcome. A lot of people paid little attention to those who had fought and sacrificed in Vietnam. Thousands of soldiers were MIA, or missing in action. It's not known whether they were dead or alive. They got information from the families, got information from the government about this. The Vietnamese, however, did allow American groups to search the countryside, but as the years went by, there was less and less chance of you getting bound. This was a long conflict, but by 1975, it's finally over. So we had been involved in Vietnam from the 60s through the 70s. So it was a long conflict. It is now the second longest conflict in U.S. history, behind Afghanistan and Iraq, Iran, the Middle East. That is the longest conflict in U.S. history. To really summarize this up, there is a lot of Vietnam movies out there. Some of them, they're not PG, but if you want to, there's a lot of good stuff. Good Morning Vietnam, great movie, Robin Williams, but there's some stuff in there. Forrest Gump covers a lot of this stuff. Forrest Gump actually serves in Vietnam. Again, there's some not such good stuff there. And if you want to learn about the training, Full Metal Jacket. No, I do not. That is, it's got a lot of stuff in there, but it's also a good Vietnam movie. So if you're looking for something to do, just look up a Vietnam movie. There's lots of stuff out there. The thing is that a lot of the soldiers who came back have PTSD, and they don't talk about what happened over there. They don't really want to, because it's not a war or a conflict that the United States is proud of, because we didn't win, we lost. So anyway, that's all for section 4 and chapter 30, and now we got to figure out how to take a test. So I'm gonna sit and do that. So.